Welcome, everybody, to this radicalized breaker. We are so grateful to have Dr. Ian Garner back with us. Dr. Garner wrote a very important book, Z Generation, Into the Hearts of Russia's Fascist Youth. We thought it was very important to bring Dr. Garner back because Putin, as everybody knows, is a war criminal, and he has literally been indicted for trafficking children on the world stage. And this occurred months ago out of The Hague. But of course, the war continues, the trafficking continues, the news cycle follows whatever horrible shiny object is in everybody's front of mind, and so these things get buried. And before we go any further, I'm just letting our viewers know that I am in the desert, and in the desert it's called internet in name only. It never works. So I'm off camera using a hotspot, and I hope everybody can hear me. But Dr. Garner, I thought it was so important that we do not ignore the massive trafficking that is occurring of Ukraine children to Russia, and why it's just happening kind of without the outrage that would actually help stop it. And I don't know what else to say. It's madness.
Well, it is. And just as an initial thought before we really get into the meat of this, it is truly striking that in Western societies, whether you're looking at the States, in Britain where I grew up, or Canada where I live now, we're obsessed with children, right? We're obsessed with looking after children and defending children, or at least, you can argue that whether we really are or not, but that's what we say. And yet this is such an enormous crime, such an enormous issue that is affecting Ukraine and Ukraine's children and their parents. And yet it doesn't seem to have captured the attention of the West in the way that the spectacle and fanfare around the death of Yevgeny Prigozhin, for example, has over the last almost week now.
Thank you so much. That was exactly my point. We just lurch from cycle to cycle, news cycle to cycle, and we don't do what we need to do as a allegedly civilized society, and make this front and center all the time. Your book, of course, very powerful, showing how how their minds are being poisoned with fascist rhetoric from a very early age, and now that's occurring to Ukraine children that are being trafficked. So what is going on there? And then I've got a quick follow-up, and then Hi-Fi, you jump in.
Yeah, so we can talk about two different kinds of Ukrainian children in this regard. The first are the probably better publicized cases of those children who've been taken by Russia and what they claim is evacuated to mainland Russia, and they are spread out all over Russia. All the way out into the Far East, you will find children who've been deposited. And they are essentially being absorbed into Russian society and taught that they are no different from Russians. Ukrainianism is an identity that can be unlearned. It's not a real identity. It's a fake idea, and that you're really Russians, right? You were born Russians, therefore you grow up Russian. And those children, I suspect, will absorb that message, if not with ease, because they will always be facing the trauma of what's happened to them, and they will always be parentless, potentially adopted, for example. That's the modus operandi, and the adoption has cropped up, for example, in the case of Maria Lvova-Belova, who is the Russian, I forget her exact job title, but the children's commissioner or whatever it is in Russia that has kind of been the face of these evacuations. She claims to have adopted some Ukrainian children who she describes as kind of semi-feral, and thank God they're being civilized by her and her family. And then we have the other kind of Ukrainian children, and those are the Ukrainian children that are still living in occupied territories in the east of Ukraine, who are effectively living in war zones, in areas that are under threat of being bombed or shelled by either side as the war returns and ebbs and flows. And I'm not suggesting that the Ukrainians are deliberately bombing children or civilians at all, but when you're in a war, casualties happen, right? And those children are in a slightly different position because they're generally still with their families in Ukraine, and therefore they have a different kind of influence on what's happening around them. Although Russia is trying to indoctrinate those children as fast as it can by changing the school curriculum, by bringing in Russian teachers, by bringing in and founding Russian paramilitary youth groups in the occupied areas. Indeed, when it comes to Mariupol, the destroyed city that was besieged last year and ultimately fell to Russia, they had founded their military youth group in Mariupol before Mariupol actually fell. Right, so that just goes to show you the speed with which they're trying to introduce these ideas into the population. Now, I suspect that those children are going to grow up with much more conflicted feelings towards the Russians and will not accept this medicine being spooned down their throats so easily. But that doesn't mean they're going to grow up necessarily to somehow rebel against Russia. And I think from the Ukrainians that I've spoken to, they're all really worried that, you know, we can't essentialize Ukrainian children as this sort of perfect nation who will forever exist, because they are just kids. And if Russia keeps going at this for years on end, and if Ukraine doesn't take the occupied territories back and doesn't retrieve these children back, then some of them will be affected by it, and some of them will be persuaded by it, while others will be deeply psychologically damaged by it.
We're talking about so much trauma and transgenerational trauma, and it just does not seem to be a global mobilization to deal with it in any meaningful way. And here in America, a film, Sound of Freedom, dropped, and the whole idea was to it was essentially a psyop. It was, you know, save the children by manipulating viewers into thinking the, you know, in our case, the Democrats or those that represented, you know, the pro-democracy side of things were coming to get your kids. So it's always something that's utilized and weaponized to, you know, in this case, to affect the outcome of the 2024 election. But we have a real crisis. And I'm not seeing the type of mobilization that we need to see in order to address it and stop it and hold those who are trafficking children accountable. And I've been told by fascist scholars that this is not something that has not happened historically, that it has. When there are fascist countries that overtake another country, they do steal children. And why is that?
I mean, there are two reasons. Firstly, the very notion of fascism is bound up with visions of the future. And it's very easy to look at Russia and think that the ruling ideology in Russia is all about the past, the Soviet Union, Tsarism, but it's not. It's about the future. Theoretically, it is meant to be about saving the nation today by adults and existing generations sacrificing themselves to somehow rejuvenate society and the spirit, and thus create better future generations. And so the fight for children who were supposedly being twisted and distorted by what's variously called Ukrainianism, Satanism, transgenderism, homosexuals, Westernism, you name it, all sorts of isms, nothing makes sense, right? Idiotism is my word for it.
I love that.
It's all about children. And the other aspect of it is that fascism functions through war. Fascism constantly has to refight this war because regenerating the nation through sacrificing the self through war can never bring the returns that are promised, right? That is not a route to the utopian future. As we're seeing in Russia, you know, life in Russia is immeasurably worse today than it was 18 months ago for many, many people.
Yeah.
Therefore, what do? Well, you have to fight another war. And what do you need to do to fight war? Well, you need bodies. You need bodies to turn into soldiers to fight for you. And so ultimately, when we think about the militarization of youth and education in Russia today, and indeed the taking of civilians forcefully from other areas, that is a means of feeding a war machine.
Hi-Fi, jump in. It's so tragic.
So we have, as Heidi was just saying, we have historical precedent for this type of thing occurring. We had the Lebensborn program during World War II, and that correlates directly to what Russia is doing in Ukraine right now. But my question for you is, how badly has the media failed us when it comes to reporting this as not just something, oh, this occurred? No, it is an ongoing thing and continues daily. Why do you think the media, how is it failing? Why is it failing? What's going on here?
Well, I think individual reporters and individual newspapers from time to time have done an excellent job, as they do, but they follow a news cycle that is designed to attract attention briefly. While something is new, it's shiny, it's exciting. And then we move on to the next thing. And we know from our experience of war and communicating about war in general, the excitement of war wears off pretty quickly. And so it is hard to find ways to reach and re-reach audiences with the shock of the old. And we've seen our stories about these children. We've heard and we've seen some excellent reporting about them, but it's no longer new. It's no longer shocking. And therefore the conversation moves on to something else. Prigozhin's death being the perfect example, where this is a very exciting story for a week. And that too was probably already beginning to die down, and the media will move on. So it's more structural and about the way that media chases or has to chase to stay afloat stories and appealing narratives, even if it means long term. They lack the focus and lack the motivation to really pay attention to some of the bigger issues that are going on in the background of the war.
It almost sounds like we're suffering
Right.
from media-induced ADHD.
Just wanted to say that even we in this conversation, we've been going, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes already. We've talked about the kidnap of children, the so-called evacuation of children, but we haven't talked about the murder of children. We haven't talked, and I apologize, this is going to be very bleak, so content warning. We haven't talked about rape of children or the sexual abuse of children, the torture of children. And all of that has been happening and continues to happen. But even we, the people that are paying attention, are not talking about it, which just goes to show how hard it is to continually force yourself as a consumer of this sort of material to face what's really happening.
That is such an incredibly profound and very important point. Every day we see another child lost to this war of annihilation, and every day we hear another story, and you're absolutely right. It's almost like a compartmentalization or survival mode in order to deal with this stuff, but it is so important that we confront it head on, because again, we've talked about this. What's happening in Ukraine is an existential crisis for liberal democracies everywhere. And I think the West is still slow to deal with that and address that. I do want to say, back to the media statement, I'm looking at a Vice headline right now. Exclusive: we interviewed the Russian woman accused of stealing 20,000 children. I mean, why? Number one. Two, the numbers are staggering. That's not the numbers that I'm seeing. I'm seeing numbers that are well in excess of that. So I feel that you're so right that not only is it the media ADHD, but it's that this is tough stuff to talk about. And your book, as incredible as it is, it's hard. It's important we read it, and it's important we are aware of it, because again, if we don't do a better job of working to defeat this stuff, it's not staying in Russia or Ukraine. It's coming here and everywhere, wherever here is.
Let's look at that Vice story a little bit, which I read when it came out, which was a few months ago now, if I remember rightly. And it was a terrible misstep, and I don't think we should be interviewing, giving airtime to any Russian leaders, ambassadors, spokespeople right now. It simply gives them a platform to spread lies, which once you go to debunking lies, it's already too late. The cat's out the bag. You've opened Pandora's box and a million other metaphors I can think about. But think about the headline, and I don't remember what the number was in the headline. And again, it's a good indication of how we consume this media. There is a phenomenon that we call psychic numbing, which basically says, and this applies in particular to war, it's hard to really make an impact on people when you simply use numbers. If in a war you report 25,000 people died yesterday, it doesn't mean much to people. It doesn't have much of an impact. And that's why the best war propaganda, or at least the most effective war propaganda, always draws on stories that are around human interest. Now, if Vice had framed that story, we talked to the woman who is responsible for the death of, I'm making it up, the death of Maria, a 4-year-old in Ukraine. We talked to a person who was responsible for the rape and torture of a 6-year-old. We named that 6-year-old, put the photograph of the 6-year-old at the top of the article. People will pay attention to that a lot more than they will pay attention to a number that says 100,000 or 200,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped. Because otherwise it just bounces off people, but it is hard to produce those stories. It takes a lot of effort to produce those stories and to report them accurately.
There was a line that was attributed to Stalin that I don't believe he ever said. And it's something like, 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million is politics, or 1 million is political. Don't know that he said it. I've heard it. I've heard it spoken, but I think that is very illustrative of what you just said. And I also think that the numbing effect is a brilliant way for us to help, get unnumb. Because you're so right. When I see the list of who died that day, my eyes glaze over, and I think my heart probably just goes into some sort of protective mode, because it's just, it's so sad.
Yeah, I can guarantee if you went to the social media, go to Twitter or whatever it is that you want to, if you were to run a study, A/B test of a post that said 700,000 Ukrainian children have been kidnapped by Russia versus a post that simply contained a picture of a child who's been killed, said this child was killed by Russia today, which would get more engagement? Does not take a genius to figure out which would be the most likely to go viral. Even though, when you think about it in purely utilitarian terms, of course, both posts would be tragic. But the one post surely should carry a lot more weight, right? Post with a huge amount of people in it, but it doesn't. That's just not the way that we think about the world and about each other.
It's also really important what Hi-Fi brought up about media. I remember reading a book by a foreign editor, maybe NBC's foreign correspondent, perhaps from the Middle East, some years ago. And he basically said that 1,000 people in Africa dying of famine is bumped off the news by 5 Egyptians getting eaten by crocodiles, which is bumped off the news by one of the Queen's corgis getting run over by a bus. And here we are. And
that is your Prigozhin story, right? One of Putin's corgis getting run over by a bus. It's enough nothingness in a sense. It matters in one sense. Yes, it's an important story. But why should it dominate the headlines for a week when Prigozhin was not a man who was likely to wield any more serious power in Russia ever again?
Absolutely.
And that's been pretty obvious for the last 2 months.
Absolutely. Absolutely. High five.
So one of the things I want to ask you about just occurred recently, and I am a former Catholic, no longer practicing, but I keep tabs on the Vatican, and the Pope reaffirmed in a speech to a bunch of Russians their imperialistic worldview, and seemed to back up their aggression. And I would like to change it officially to the Vatican, but I don't know if that'll fly. But what are your thoughts on this?
When I first saw this story go viral, I wondered if it was real, and I wanted some careful source checking. But now there's a video that's going around with subtitles in Russian that seems to confirm that it's true. So I suspect it probably is, although I don't speak Italian, so I can't guarantee that what the translation is actually an accurate rendering of the Italian, and I haven't seen this reported in newspapers either. And it's easy to criticize, and I think this is entirely worthy of criticism in any way. I don't know what he's doing, but maybe what the Pope is trying to do, if we give him full credit, is to try and find some common ground with young Russians, to try and get them to see eye to eye. And I did read the transcript of the speech that was posted on the Vatican's website, which wasn't about imperialism. It was very much about peace, about trying to find ways to end wars. And so I wonder how, whatever happens, whether they cut the end of the speech in the transcript or whether there was a Q&A, I would love to see a full transcript or full, well-sourced subtitles for what really happened, because what he said, and I said this publicly when I heard confirmation of the news, was absolutely comparable to what you would find in a new Russian history textbook in terms of praising young Russians as the heirs to this great empire, to the heritage of Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, these great imperial conquerors, and that's how they're known in Russia, and that's how they're taught in Russia. So it may be an attempt to reach out, or it may be just pure naivety, total lack of critical faculties. But either way, I'm sure, and I haven't looked at it yet, I'm sure Russian propagandists will make mincemeat of this stuff, and it will only serve them well, regardless of what the real intention was.
Well, you bring up a great point, and we will ask our friend Monique Camara to do a translation for us. She lives in Italy, speaks Italian, because that is a great point. Do you remember when there was the controversy with the Dalai Lama, which turned out to just be a misinterpretation? He was not trying to French kiss young boys. It literally was something that was distorted. And so it's very important that we do ensure we have an accurate translation. And if in fact we do, then your point, of course, is very well taken. We have a friend, Keir Giles. You may know him. He just wrote Russia's War on Everybody. He says one of the things that's very helpful when trying to frame what Russia is doing and why is that we have to look at them as if they're still in a mindset of the 1500s. And I know with your experience, having lived there, having seen this period of openness where you had described, you could go to, in St. Petersburg, a bar that, was your classic club, and right next door, the same owner would have a gay club, and it was acceptable. That is not the case anymore. But do you have any thoughts on Keir sort of believing that the Enlightenment passed Russia by?
I love Keir. I think he's right about lots of things, but I think it's a mistake to constantly go back to historical comparisons, because what we are dealing with is a uniquely modern phenomenon. And I would argue, and this is what I do in the Z Generation book, that this is a postmodern phenomenon of life in Russia. They're not going back to the 1500s. The state and Russian society is exploiting the fact that the internet makes reality malleable. And that's what you guys talk about all the time on here when you talk about QAnon. That we can live in alternative realities. I've just been rereading, oh, you can't see it because it's blocking this out beautifully. I've just been rereading Simulations by Baudrillard, which is a very complicated work of French philosophy. But if you want to get your head around the complete collapse of the distinction between reality and what we would call as scholars mediatized reality, that is the reality that is fed to us or consumed to us virtually, then Baudrillard is where you go. And if we simply say Russians are living like they are in the 1500s, then we would say, well, actually, they're not connected to the outside world. They're not connected to each other. They're living, in a sense, they're living outside of history, and they're living outside of ideas like nationhood, for example, which effectively for most people did not exist in the 1500s. No, Russians are very attached to the world through the internet. They are very attached to the idea of some sense of Russian nationhood, but those things can be very distorted and made very flexible thanks to the way that, in particular, social media functions. And this is only going to get more mind-bogglingly weird over the next few years as artificial intelligence, deep fakes, and all that jazz takes off in a big way. And I genuinely, it's going to sound really pessimistic, but I just see this getting worse over the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Yeah.
Across all of our societies, not just Russia.
Yes, well, because we don't have Western leaders standing up and declaring that this is even occurring at the level that it's occurring at. And I should say that Keir is referring primarily, as I understand it, to how the Kremlin's characters interact with defenestrations and poisoning and their motivations. But in a way, I think that you're both right in him addressing how its leaders are behaving versus this very modern connected world, which is, yes.
If that's what he meant, then yeah, I think that's fair. And listen, this is a brutal society. Unlike all totalitarian societies, life becomes cheap and death becomes a spectacle, something to be relished, something to not just demonstrate power to people and would-be challengers, but also something to be witnessed and enjoyed, something that in and of itself is meant to be rejuvenating for regime supporters.
So we discuss, this, who really cares about Prigozhin? The fact is he's removed from the board. Doesn't matter if he's dead or if he's on an island in the Pacific and we never see him again. He's removed from the board. So that argument is gone. One thing I see a lot of, and CNN just did this kind of milquetoast. Oh, hey, there might be Westerners pushing Russian propaganda, maybe unwittingly. That seems like a load of crap, because more and more I'm seeing these kind of no-name professors being touted by the media as taking a strong anti-Ukraine / pro-Russian stance. And are you seeing that as much in Canada? Are you seeing these chaos actors being outed or coming to the fore as much as we are in the United States, or no?
I think that the Canadian media is probably a little bit more hesitant to platform people who don't have much expertise, and I'm not going to name anyone because I don't want to get sued, but there are certainly some, I hesitate to say respected, but there are some well-known faces in Canada that are highly questionable. And of course, the leading figure is, and this is the one that I will name, a certain Jordan Peterson.
Refer to votniksoup.com for more on Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson was actually outed by the Byline Times as being funded by Peter Thiel in pushing kind of a white supremacist, nationalistic race science in the UK. So it really is turning into this multinational group of bad actors that are just kind of, it's almost like they're doing a talk show circuit around certain countries. I mean, we have Tucker Carlson attempting to interview Putin, and that seems like a terrible idea all the way around.
Yeah, and as I already said, there is no point interviewing Russian politicians, Russian leaders, Russian ambassadors right now, because they're just going to use the platform to spread lies. They are going to lie. And no amount of fact checking is going to work in a world in which people live in alternate realities.
Right. Well, I would like to, before we let you go back to your book for a moment, the book Z Generation. Right now in real time, Russian youth are being pushed toward fascist philosophies, totalitarian ideas. And is there anything the West can do about it? And can you please jar them into why something needs to be done about this? I know you mentioned before that we could psyop them with truth. We have truth on our side. So let's go start, psyoping back, but we just don't.
Well, I think that the thing to remember is that we can't psyop them in a way that is too jarring for their beliefs. If we simply march in, and this is Alexei Navalny's team do this, they produce these phenomenally well-researched and well-produced videos that are full of truth about the corruption of Russian officials, about how much money they've embezzled, the yachts they own, the massive homes they own while Russians starve. And it's great stuff. But all you're going to get is a knee-jerk reaction from the audience you're trying to reach of, well, screw you, Putin's my guy, he's on my side, you're the Western side, you're a bunch of liars. So it has to come, or appear to come, from within Russia for a start. And it has to just gently move people step by step away from what they believe right now. It has to be done very subtly. And certainly Western governments are doing some things already, but they need to take this seriously. There is, I think, in the halls of power, an assumption that it is inevitable that young Russians will move away from authoritarianism, will move away from Putinism and away from war. And that might be true, right? I'm not saying that Russians are inevitably going to become more warlike or something won't happen to change what they believe right now. But the risk is that that's wrong. What if that's wrong and we simply find ultra-nationalist power in Russia bedding down, buoyed up by bubbles of fake reality persistently over the next few years? Russia is basically a QAnon state, as it already is, right? That's the mindset of many people living within it, including the non-crazy warmongers. They're also living in some pretty weird realities, even if they don't want the war. Right, so we have to take this seriously, and it is cheap to do this kind of work. And you know what, as you do it, you're going to save a lot of young Russians who are marginalized by the state because they are ethnic minorities, because they are queer, because in some way they don't fit into a very narrow definition of what it means to be Russian. You're going to help those Ukrainian children that have been taken by the Russian state. And so it's the right thing to do morally, even once we take out the question of war and violence and aggression.
Just amazing. I'm just wrapping my head around the QAnon state of Russia. That is just so incredibly tragic, poignant, and accurate. So we hear always about saving the children. We have a real crisis, as you said. It's not just the kidnapping of children in this war, but it's also the raping and murdering of children in this war. What can we in the West do to affect, change and to stop this horror from continuing?
I think that the answer is, for now, that Russia shows absolutely no sign of changing its behavior in this regard, nor of punishing troops who break laws. And therefore, the answer is the same answer to almost all things. Ukraine has to win the war. Russia has to be driven out of Ukraine. And I know it's not going to be easy. I know it's going to be awful, but simply the calls to say, well, we will allow Russia to continue to occupy parts of Ukrainian territory. If you do that, even aside from questions of the war that may flare up again, Russia may attack somebody else, may re-attack Ukraine in the future, you are condemning the people living in those territories to what is conceivably an ongoing genocide. And that's wrong. That is absolutely wrong. And anybody who argues differently has lost their fucking mind.
Thank you for that. We could not have asked for more. I'll just end with something I also mentioned to Keir, that Yale professor Timothy Snyder, who wrote On Tyranny, said 100 years from now, should we still be around 100 years from now, the history books will reflect what they will write about during this time is the war in Ukraine, and that it's truly up to the West and to America whether or not this war is won. What can we tell Americans about why and how they need to support a swift end to this war?
We're really talking about the weirder ends of the Republican Party, right? Because support is much higher amongst Democrats. And you tell them this. You tell them that this is the cheapest and easiest way to make America stronger, without any Americans dying, without Americans having to fight. You win this war, you weaken Russia. You enrich America. Life is better for you and your family. That's a strong message. And it's very self-interested. It's not a nice argument to have to make, right? Because the argument should be moral and it should be ethical. But that is not an argument that is, I think, going to cut through the Republican audience.
That was a mic drop. That was brilliant. I mean, I got nothing else. I mean, that was just so perfect. That's exactly what we need to do. And I will say that self-interest will cut through some of the BS BS arguments from the other side. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Ian Garner. The book is Z Generation: Into the Hearts of Russia's Fascist Youth. It's important. Please support his work and learn how you can be helpful. Hi-Fi, any last thoughts?
Slava Ukraine.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. Thank you. This was a RadPod breaker live from the desert with no internet and a hotspot. But RadPod's never been known for great technology, but we have been known for incredible content. And thank you again for your time today. It's so meaningful to us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.